In the 20th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard, reveals again his death and resurrection, and responds to a request from two disciples. Jesus tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard, in which a landowner hires workers at different hours of the day but pays all of them the same wage. This creates discontent among those who work the whole day, but Jesus teaches that the landowner has the right to do as he pleases with what belongs to him. Next, Jesus predicts again his death and resurrection, telling the disciples that he will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, condemned to death, and will rise again on the third day. After this prediction, the mother of James and John approaches Jesus and asks that her sons be seated at his side in the kingdom. Jesus responds that this is not his to grant, but it will be given to those whom the Father has determined. When the other disciples hear about James and John's request, they become indignant. Jesus calls them and teaches that in the hierarchy of the kingdom, the greatest is the one who serves others, just as he himself came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. In the 20th chapter of Matthew, Jesus teaches about the grace and generosity of God, illustrated by the parable of the workers in the vineyard. He also predicts his death and resurrection again, emphasizing the significance of these events for the fulfillment of his mission. Furthermore, Jesus teaches about humility and service, exhorting his disciples to follow his example. In the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey, cleanses the temple, heals the blind, and confronts the religious leaders. Jesus instructs his disciples to find a donkey and its colt in a nearby village, so that he can enter Jerusalem riding on them. This fulfills the Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah. When Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, a crowd receives him with joy and acclaims him as the Son of David. He enters the temple and drives out the sellers and money changers, declaring that the temple is meant to be a house of prayer, but they have turned it into a den of thieves. Following this, Jesus performs healings in the temple, curing the blind and the lame. This causes admiration from the children, who praise Jesus as the Son of David, much to the displeasure of the chief priests and scribes. The religious leaders question Jesus' authority, and he responds with a series of parables, including the parable of the two sons, the parable of the wicked tenants, and the parable of the wedding feast. These parables aim to teach spiritual lessons and confront the unbelief of the religious leaders. In the 21st chapter of Matthew, Jesus enters Jerusalem triumphantly, fulfilling prophetic acts such as riding on a donkey and confronting the religious corruption in the temple. He demonstrates his power through healings and imparts important lessons through parables. These chapters teach us about Jesus' humility and his role as the Messiah, highlighting the importance of true worship and the need for repentance and faith. Jesus confronts the hypocrisy and unbelief of the religious leaders, pointing to his role as the only way to salvation. In the 22nd chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast, confronts the religious leaders with various questions, and warns the people about the hypocritical teachings of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast, in which a king prepares a banquet for his son, but the invited guests refuse to come. The king sends his servants to invite others, both good and bad, to fill the banquet. However, a man without a wedding garment is cast out for not being properly prepared. The parable illustrates the importance of accepting the invitation of God's kingdom and preparing oneself adequately for it. After the parable, the Pharisees and the Herodians try to trap Jesus with a question about paying taxes to Caesar. Jesus responds wisely, saying to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Next, the Sadducees bring a question about the resurrection, citing the law of levirate marriage. Jesus answers by affirming the reality of the resurrection and arguing that God is the God of the living, not the dead. The Pharisees, upon hearing Jesus answer the questions well, decide to test him again, this time asking, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus responds that the greatest commandment is to love God with all one's heart, soul, and mind, and the second is to love one's neighbor as oneself. Finally, Jesus questions the Pharisees about the Christ's lineage, citing Psalm 110, and warns the people to beware of the hypocritical teachings of the scribes and Pharisees. In the 22nd chapter of Matthew, Jesus teaches through parables and confronts the religious leaders with challenging questions. He emphasizes the importance of accepting the invitation of God's kingdom and preparing oneself adequately. Jesus answers questions about taxes, resurrection, and the greatest commandment, highlighting the need to love God and one's neighbor. He warns about the hypocritical teachings of the religious leaders and exhorts the people to be vigilant regarding them.